Greetings, viewers. On the 11th of September 1999, a political movement was born, the movement called the Movement for Democratic Change, which went on to become a force on our political arena, the only movement that ended a defeat to Robert Mugabe. That was in 2008, where Robert Mugabe lost. The only election that he lost in Zimbabwe post-independence was to that party, the Movement for Democratic Change, as led by Morgan Tsvangirai. It is played a critical role in our political discourse, but at the moment, the party seems to have degenerated. It has lost the impact and significance it used to have. In this September, we want to remember the MDC and see if we have key learnings that we can draw from the formation, existence, and how it lost relevance and impact. To help us to engage in this particular discourse, we have invited Comrade Takura Zhangazha, a man who needs not much introduction to most Zimbabweans who follow events that happen in this country. Comrade Takura Zhangazha is one of the people who were there at the formation of the MDC. We want to understand from him what are the processes which led to the formation, and from where he stands, what led to the demise of that once formidable opposition movement. Comrade Takura, you can engage our viewers.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me, Comrade President Masaru. It's always good to have a chat with you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Takura. Maybe let's just quickly jump into it. 11 September 1999. Where were you at that point in time?
We were part of the founding congress of the MDC in Zhangazha, at the aquatic complex in Zhangazha, and that's where there was the inaugural congress, inaugural leadership, which included Morgan Tsvangirai as the president, Gibson Sibanda as the deputy, other comrades that are now luminaries, including Nelson, who was the inaugural youth chairperson of the party, and then Mojongwe was the spokesperson, Opo Gombo was in the executive, Washman Ngube. I mean, the list is quite broad. Paul Tembanyati, the treasurer. So you had a whole lot of people at the Zhangazha Aquatic Complex at that time.
Okay, great. So, but what were the conditions, the material conditions, socio-economic conditions, political conditions in Zimbabwe, which necessitated the formation of this party then in 1999?
Well, it was mainly the economic situation in Zimbabwe and the protests that were being led by the then ZCTU leadership, the stairways, the big civil servants strike in I think 1996. So there was a whole movement and momentum around the economic situation in Zimbabwe at that time, which was really, really terrible, because we had a government that was implementing economic structural adjustment policies as led by the World Bank. So it opened up the Zimbabwean markets, economic markets, jobs were lost, and then we had a whole influx of foreign goods, radios, TVs, and this undermined local industry, and people were essentially laid off from their jobs. And then there was also inflation, because in part the government had also decided to immediately compensate. I think it was in 97 when they decided to compensate all veterans out of budget, and that affected the Zimbabwean currency greatly. And then there was also the war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which led to a lot of international investors in Zimbabwe having cold feet. And this is before the start of the fast track land reform program in 2000. This is actually the economic situation before things then actually got out of hand even further. So the background was that the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions had become a leader of public opinion and public perception around how the country was being badly run by the ruling party. And we had the National Constitutional Assembly as well talking about constitutional reform. And Morgan Tsvangirai, who was also the ZCTU Secretary General, chaired the National Constitutional Assembly. And we were part of that process of pushing for democratic reforms, including a new constitution for Zimbabwe people, what we called then a people-driven constitution. So you had a whole emerging social movement that then began to ask questions about power in the country. There were a lot of grassroots activists, a lot of teachers like yourself, a lot of nurses, and a lot of women rights activists, feminists, were beginning to say, but it's not enough to try and lobby the government. Why don't we think about trying to contest for political power based on our social movement and based on a left-leaning and social democratic sort of ideological pretext? So that was the emerging context, the economic and political and social context. And that also then led to people then saying, if we form a political party, who can lead it? And the ZCTU was mandated to organize what was called a National Working People's Convention, both as an event, but more importantly, as a national consultative process of workers' leaders, union leaders, teachers, nurses, students, particularly ZINASU, going right around the country, asking people about the way forward. And the way forward was a clear declaration that the ZCTU should form or lead the formation of a working people's party. That was what it was referred to, a working people's party. Not necessarily a workers' party in the final analysis, but a working people's party, which then encompassed whether you were a unionist, whether you were a rural farmer, whether you were a student and student leader, a nurse, and a teacher. You could be part of a working people's movement. That's what got us to the formation of the party.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very helpful. But now looking at the formative stages, we understand it was a struggle against the economic structural adjustment programs. Like you said, it was left-leaning formation, but then bringing different ideological camps into the same space because it is now like a broad church of some sort. Maybe if you could just highlight some key ideological camps that were within this broad church at the formation stages.
Well, at that time, the general trend, this is post the Cold War, the general trend was a way that at that time, because even in the UK and in the West, you had Bill Clinton as president of the United States, Tony Blair as the prime minister of the UK, I think Walesa in Poland as the prime minister of Poland. So there was a general ideological trend towards what was called a third way. And then you had, of course, Thabo Mbeki pushing the African Renaissance at that time. So globally, there was an ideological trend towards a third way between capitalism and socialism. And that was generally referred to as social democracy. So that was the main thrust of the then ZCTU. And by that time, they had worked with, I think, the legendary likes of Timothy Kondo, Dr. Kanyenze now. They had worked on a document called Beyond ISAP. So the main ideological thrust was to find a better way beyond neoliberal economics, which had become dominant after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So within the ZCTU itself, the dominant ideological thrust was social democracy. But when it became more of a broader movement with other civil society organizations, the social democratic aspect was left out. But I remember distinctly Comrade Munyara Zigwisai from the International Socialist Organization and the members thereof insisting that this should remain a workers' party, and the workers' party must represent primarily the workers' interests. But other colleagues, more or less the intellectuals slash lawyers, were more inclined to a more liberal version of social democracy. And when I say liberal here, I don't mean it in the economic sense. I mean it's more as it relates to issues of human rights, and that was mainly via the NCA. Brian Kagoro's, Tendai BT's, Love Maduku's, Tokumache. I mean, the list is quite endless. I can't mention all of the colleagues that were there. And we were then part of then a very open-ended ideological framework. It was like a mixed bag of ideological contestations. But at the Congress, it was declared and officially recognized at the inaugural Congress that the MDC would be a social democratic party. It would be a party that pushes for social democracy. But it had internal contradictions at that time. So you had the actual social democrats, mainly coming from Labour. Then you had the liberal democrats, mainly coming from what was then a nascent human rights civil society that were part of the movement. And then you had the socialists proper, that were still representing workers and doing shop floor and grassroots sort of activism around socialism as an ideology. But what triumphed at that inaugural Congress was a position that said the party would be social democratic.
Oh, okay, great. So, but now there is a take that then develops where the MDC is characterized as a party which is pro-West. It is also owned by white farmers. If you have an appreciation on how did this take come about, because I think when we then go into 2000 to 2005 and beyond, the major issue that's raised by the ruling ZANU-PF is that these are Western puppets. They are sponsored by white farmers. How did this arise?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, which is, I think, subject to multiple interpretations. I just have my own, based on my own experiences in the movement, at least its formative stages. Yeah, it was mainly coming from the facts of the 2000 referendum, the constitutional referendum, where initially it was the ZCTU and the inaugural Congress of the Movement for Democratic Change that actually identified land as a big issue. This was against the backdrop of the 1997 Shoshe farm invasions and in general sporadic invasions of farms by peasant farmers who were saying we want our land back, we fought for the land, etc. And it was the ZCTU and the Movement for Democratic Change that started talking about land beyond the liberation struggle framework. And when that happened, and when ZANU also realized in part that it was losing political support, it then also decided to revamp its argument around land and use the constitutional referendum to pitch land reform more than civil society and the opposition did. And it pitched it at a very radical angle. And yes, there was interaction with what was then called the Commercial Farmers Union. I think it still exists between opposition, political parties, civil society activists, the NCA, and the MDC. There was that stakeholder interaction, though the CFU would interact with everyone to protect its interests. But at some points, yes, the white farmers became a bit more interested in the MDC as an opposition, but towards the 2000 referendum, constitutional referendum, and visibly so, including a period in which the late comrade Zhangazha appeared on an international TV news channel, getting checks signed for him, and that's when it sort of escalated by white commercial farmers, and that's when the narrative began, because the ruling ZANU-PF party also had its own campaign team led by Jonathan Moyo, Professor Jonathan Moyo, which then picked that up and ran with it for a while, but they still lost the constitutional referendum in 2000 and decided to try and punish the whole country for that.
What's your take? Some would say the 2000 constitution, as proposed by government, if the opposition had supported that one, it was a better constitution than what we have. And obviously, Mugabe's tenure in office was going to be reduced, because then it was going to be 2 terms from 2000. And then maybe Zimbabwe stood a chance of transforming from the ZANU-PF dictatorship if by some chance the opposition had embraced that constitutional proposal from government.
No, that's a wishy-washy argument, and it's almost like legalistic. The constitutional referendum of 2000 was not a legal referendum. It was a referendum on ZANU-PF as a government. It was a public display, electoral public display of how unhappy the majority of Zimbabweans were with the state of affairs in the country as led by ZANU-PF as a ruling party. That is, it was a very political referendum. It wasn't about the technicalities of the future or, and I told you so, sort of political event. No, it was an immediate reflection of how the people of Zimbabwe felt. So anyone who argues about what could have been had the Constitution 2000 passed and not been rejected is being simplistic. The political reality was that referendum was almost like a process of catharsis, national catharsis, where people really had to then show and demonstrate their feelings towards the government. It was not a referendum to oust the government. It was a referendum to tell the government that what it was doing, the people of Zimbabwe were not happy with it. And no, it was not a better constitution, because it was not people-driven. And neither, in my personal view, is the current constitution a better one, because it was not people-driven. It was all negotiated in the final analysis, where you had political parties determining the content of the constitutions, and also trying as much as is possible to push their members to support their side. The 2000 constitution and its rejection essentially was based on the fact that the majority of Zimbabweans were not happy with the serving or sitting governments as led by ZANU-PF at that time.
And now we look at the MDC itself. It appears like a party that only dominated in urban areas, failed to really penetrate in rural areas. Of course, in 2008, they made significant inroads. But also then the relationship between the party and the liberation war heroes, the war veterans, they never really had a strong relationship with that particular group, which of us obviously remained as the strongest ideological camp for ZANU-PF. What would you attribute to some of these? What would you think are the reasons why they failed to have a strong penetration in rural areas and this better relationship with those who had fought for liberation in Zimbabwe?
I will give you my own personal experiences as an example. There was a strong rural presence of civil society between and opposition activists, even smaller political parties. Muzorewa's party, Ndabaningi's party, Zanundonga, I think. They had rural presence, except that it was more like provincial rural presence. Civil society organizations could actually hold workshops I worked for the NCA in Mashonaland East for about a year, and we could go to Mutoko, Mudzi, etc. There was a strong rural presence. What then happened with the formation of the MDC, and in particular after the initial parliamentary elections in 2000, the war veterans and ZANU-PF supporters became more violent and made or created what I wanted to call, what we called almost like exclusion zones, where it was no longer safe to undertake rural activities and activism on behalf of either a civil society organization or a political party if you were involved in that at that time. But initially, there was widespread rural reach and rural acceptance of opposition politics until there was counter mobilization and prevention of freedom of association, freedom of expression in rural areas by the ruling party. And I know some of the war veterans I interact with still know that every time we have a discussion, we always say, look, we know your concerns, we know your problems around your pensions and your welfare, but we also don't forget that you were part of the machinery that prevented an expansion of civil society and even opposition political reach in the rural areas. So, but I would hazard to also add that war veterans were not completely disconnected from opposition politics. And as you know, they are highly factionalized anyway. So they had some factions that were working closely with the MDC. And some of them were senior war veterans, like the late Dr. Mshonga, the late Comrade Tinashe Machingura, also known as Wilfred Manda, with this Zimbabwe Liberators platform. They were directly involved in opposition and civil society activities, though they may not have been as supported as they should have been, because war veterans were sometimes viewed with cynicism, but they were engaged, and I mean, I would see Comrade Zino at various meetings and various workshops and being an active participant in pro-democracy activism. So the war veterans were not completely uniform in their approach to opposition politics, but the loudest were, of course, those that were aligned to the ruling party, like my homeboy Chinotimba and so on. So yeah, that was the reality of the rural outreach. But I must also add a very important point here before you move on to the next question. The rural outreach of the opposition depended even of civil society, whether it was the NCA, Zim Rights, take your pick, depended heavily on teachers, heavily. If you had a contact person in Murewa, if you had a contact person in Bikita, Nkai, it would normally be an ordinary teacher, genuinely committed to democratic reform, human rights narratives. And these were always the first victim. It would be the teacher, and then it would be the health worker, the nurse, or those that we used to do, because that's where the opposition slogan came from, Chinjamaitiro, that used to do public health work in the rural areas, because it was initially about public health and Blair toilets. And so that's where the slogan Chinjamaitiro came from. And I forgot the colleague's name because he was actually recognized at that inaugural Congress as being the author of the slogan, though it was more a health sector, a public service, public health sector slogan. So these were very key colleagues that helped expand the rural outreach of the MDC until there was a pushback, a violent pushback from ZANU-PF activists, and they must be continuously recognized for that.
Yeah, yeah. then we also have the issue. The MDC is known for fracturing along the way so much that I think the first official split comes in 2005. But before that, we have the comrades like Bisai being expelled from the party, I think as early as 2003 or so. Then more factions and more splits came along the way. What would you your comment, what was driving these splits within the party, what was, I think at some point they then had to come back around 2008 to form a broader alliance, trying to bring the different factions from that had been created by the splitting. What drove these splits?
Like I said, when you asked about ideological differences, like I said, you had the social democrats in the party, the working people or the workers, quite literally, or people with a proper labor union background who were in the lead of the party. Then you had the liberal Democrats, the ones that were more keen on human rights. And so by the time the initial leadership of the party emerged, it was like a marriage between the social democrats and the liberal democrats. And the liberal democrats tended more to be lawyers or seasoned human rights, civil society activists with that sort of background. And the social democrats, like Anna Morgan and Amdara Morgan, tended to be more the unionists, grassroots, on the ground sort of activists, who would understand the sentiment better. But as the party grew, there were more and more differences around how to approach the political side of things. Because remember, when you have a social movement that then forms a political party, a political party's mission is to acquire electoral power. A social movement's mission is normally to actually change society for the better, progressive change for that matter. And there was an imbalance between what was required to acquire power, electoral power, and this imbalance was largely caused by a scramble for resources to run a party, a scramble for resources to win an election. So by the time the MDC registered its first presence in parliament, there was a disjuncture between the narratives of what is it to be a parliamentarian versus what is it to be a party leader versus what is the narrative that the MDC itself, as a working people's party, wanted to push, continue to push. So the entrance of the MDC into parliament and its direct pursuit of power, especially its initial one with the presidential election of 2002, because as you recall, our elections were separated. They were not as harmonized as they are now. You'd have a parliamentary election, and then you'd have a presidential election. So that quest for power also brought in various financial and business interests, including still white commercial farmer interests. We have to be honest about that. And this is where, again, when you talk about the International Socialist Organization, the expulsion of Comrade Busai, because it was around, again, the land question, where the MDC was now trying to become a bit more moderate in its intentions around land reform, because it would then fall into ZANU-PF's narratives. So it was really a question of the ideological divisions, the entrance of varied and variegated economic interests into the party, and its eventual shift from social democratic values to more liberal democratic values, more property based individual rights, and more a reflection of global economic trends, as well as, and I have to be honest about this, as well as a new tendency within the movements and civil society to reflect more what, let's say, a particular supportive embassy, a particular supportive donor wanted or intended, either based on their funding or based on a new value system which would mix admiration for the global north, America, the UK, Europe, with ideological predispositions to neoliberalism or capitalism, to be more blunt. So we lost our way in the process. That's why we had these continual splits. And the pursuit of power in and of itself, to be numero uno, to be number one. A lot of comrades thought they were the best in the party, the best thing that ever happened to the party. And they tended, particularly the liberal democratic side of the party, tended to be a bit arrogant and to look down upon those with the working people's background or working class background. They understood that they needed them for the popularity, because Anna Moge and Anamdara Gibson were much more popular than a lot of the other colleagues in the party. Um, and their populism was more seen more by the liberal side of the party as a vehicle to which to ascend eventually to the top of the party. But the Social Democrats or the former labor union leaders stuck it out, and they stuck it out quite arrogantly, if you ask me. I remember, the split that you mentioned, the first one. Uh, Morgan Changre actually lost I think the vote in the national executive, but he insisted that it doesn't matter. He's the party leader and he's not going to participate in what was then the initial Senate elections after 2000. So, yes, the splits were caused by egos, ideological differences, financial interference and interests, and also donor control and interests.
Then there's this phase where people get into the inclusive government, and others feel like this is the stage where the party was severely weakened. What's your take on the participation of the MDC in that particular inclusive government? What would have been done differently during that particular period when Mugabe refused to accept defeat, and then there was this settlement that came through?
Yeah. So what are you saying about the inclusive government?
Well, yes, I'm saying there are different schools of thought. Some would say Morgan, by getting into that particular inclusive government, having won the election, um, that particular process weakened the MDC in a way because they went into government the same way ZAPO was weakened by going into the GNU, and they got trappings from government and became dissociated from the people because they were now viewed as the same elites as like ZANU-PF. So I was just trying to say, from where you stand, what could have been done differently from the moment ZANU-PF refused to give in to accept the defeat? What do you think could have been done differently, or if it was the right thing to do then?
The inclusive government was the most pragmatic. I would not say right. I would say most pragmatic thing to do at that time, because as you are aware, globally, the global superpowers from the West had adopted an ideological position around liberal, what they called liberal interventionism. So, were it not for SADC and Thabo Mbeki's mediation, Zimbabwe was at a high risk, and this is my personal view, but it's also evidenced by some of the books that the likes of Frank Chikane have written and the British general has written, and what Thabo Mbeki has also insisted on. Zimbabwe was at high risk of being either invaded or being put under UN sanctions, which are different from Western sanctions, because when you get sanctioned by the UN, you quite literally become an Iraq or in Afghanistan. So we it was the most pragmatic, political, internally and externally thing to do for Zimbabwe at that time. The inclusive government. I was also involved in some of the negotiations around the inclusive government, mainly as what Namdara Morgan would refer to as a civil society representative. But yes, we were there with, we would go to South Africa, come back, have some meetings and so on. But yeah, it was the most pragmatic thing to do. So you cannot fault the MDC for that. You can fault them for what they then did in the inclusive government, and how they, I wouldn't say, like you're trying to put it, became elitist. I think they just became less organic. They forgot their own history and they forgot the workers' backing that led them to become a reality, a political reality. And they fell into the neoliberal economic narratives, particularly where you look at the fact that they were in charge of the Ministry of Finance, also the ministry, I think it was Mashakada who was the Ministry of Economic Planning or Development, and various other ministries, like even education, where they also enabled further privatization of education. But their role in the inclusive government was a disaster, to be honest. They didn't have enough experience of being in government. They had more experience of being in opposition. And they also lost touch with their own grassroots and also increasingly ignored their own party's internal democratic processes. You just have like arbitrary changes to the constitution or announcements about new vice presidents and so on. So it was their performance in the inclusive government is a terrible one. But they also forgot that ZANU was baiting them, trying to get them into a comfort zone. So by the time they had the election in 2013, they were not ready for it. They didn't have enough internal organizational capacity, and they had lost a number of their own supporters, and they had again sort of had new factions emerging. You know, I think Ghana, Elton Manguma then also decided that they no longer want to be part of the MDC and things like that. So they were, to, to put it simply, within the inclusive government, they were hoisted by their own uh, petards. They made their. It was not ZANU-PF's strict fault that they performed badly. It was their fault.
Yeah. Maybe then we look at the transition. We know the MDC for some time, Morgan Tsvangirai was the man, but at the expiry of his biological existence, that transition from Morgan Tsvangirai to a new leadership, how they managed the transition. What would be your comment on how they managed that transition from the Morgan era to the new era of Nelson Chamisa?
It was it was it was somewhat uncomfortable and distasteful because it happened before the man was actually laid to rest. It was almost like a contestation over his funeral or his body, um, and his last wishes, as it were. It was from my own personal perspective, highly unconstitutional within the ambit of the MDC constitution. But at the same time, it was highly populist and emotive and opportunistic. So it was not organized. It was more opportunistic than it was pragmatic and a reflection of the democratic culture of the MDC internally or externally. So it was not handled well at all, and it became a reality because of popular anti-ruling party sentiment that anybody else who is entertaining and somewhat legitimate within the opposition circles can be the alternative candidates to ZANU's Robert Mugabe, or now, as is the case, Emerson Mnangagwa. But they handled it terribly. It was a disaster. But it gave birth to a new formation, which electorally did quite well. But it also dissipated and weakened internal democratic processes within the then MDC, and I don't know about the Triple C at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe just to close that particular chapter, if you would just, of course, you've already touched on most of the issues. Just what do you think, a summary, led to the demise of the MDC? Just a few areas that you think can be corrected going forward in the future if other people are interested in forming a movement.
Well, fundamentally, it was personal differences and egos, and a lack of what we leftists know to be collective responsibility. That when decisions are made, it's not about individuals' well-being or power issues or power needs. It's about the collective responsibility and well-being of the party or of the movement, if you're in the movement, or a civil society organization or even a labor union. You cannot individualize power. You cannot make it only be about you and your ego. You cannot mimic ZANU PF's leadership styles, because if you mimic, you can't beat them. If you mimic them, you can't beat them. They're better at it than us, and they've been at it since the liberation struggle. So it's their tradition and their culture. Ours was supposed to be a more democratic culture internally and externally. It was supposed to be more transparent political culture, and we failed at that. And we also had a problem with the fact that we were easily swayable ideologically and in terms of our values. We were shiftable. Instead of remaining true to movement, original movements, union, social democratic values, the MDC, and it is still the case today with all of our opposition parties and their factions, they fell victim to the electoral cycle. As is the case now, people are waiting for elections. That's why there's nothing happening, Chiri serious, Chiri democratic, about internal party processes until the 2028 election date is announced and people are fighting for candidatures for local governments and parliaments and also the presidency. So we taenda nemepo, to put it simply. Kungwenda nemepo. Kana America yards, no democracy, that's where we would go. Britain yards, kwavane mari, yabva neuku, kwaenda nemari to tear off it. So we were not very principled. That's what brought down the initial demise of the opposition as in the MDC. Highly personalized, individual, egoistic leadership, a lack of commitment to values and principles, and by that, basically being swayable, almost being taken anywhere and everywhere. And then also a lack of, as a last point on your question there, a lack of generational praxis. So by this, I mean, we did not teach the younger activists the values of the struggle, the origins of the struggle, the reasons of the struggle. Instead, we projected upon them, in part, a struggle that related to materialism and well-being, a struggle that became more and more a form of employment than a form of organic activism. And it carried over to cases of corruption in local government, cases of corruption in the inclusive government, cases of corruption even in parliament. So, and corruption that implicated a number of us, not us, but a number of activists and leaders within the opposition movement. So that gave a bad impression about what the struggle is about. It became about acquisition of wealth and money, and it's still a problem today. And you'll see it by the time we if we are both alive, if we get to 2027 and electoral talk ramps up, you'll see again that it is actually part of the problem.
Yeah. So maybe in concluding, given the obtaining objective and subjective conditions, if you were going to be asked to recommend both the process and the actors to say how do we revive, of course, the struggle as it were in 1999, create a new vehicle that can really fight for the people, which is not elections based, like you said. What would you recommend as the process, mainly the process itself, given the current conditions obtaining in Zimbabwe at the moment?
Yeah, I have been to a couple of labor-related meetings where ZCTU and other new unions like yours, ATU's, PTUZ, and the Civil Servants Union, I forgot the name, were there. And I think there's some sort of like consensus about holding a new Working People's Convention, as led again by the unions, but also civil society and any interested political actors. So that would be the first start as a process to review as a collective, to consult the people of Zimbabwe again, and see their general view of where the country is headed. Because right now the country is highly business oriented, at least those in power. They are pro-business. They don't really care about poor people, unions, and they tend to abuse religion to push forward their points and link up with pastors and individual rich business people to try and push their neoliberal narrative. So those on the left, those that are historically from the left or even in the middle, the liberals, They need to reconvene and chart a way forward for the country beyond the elections, beyond electoral cycles. That is quite necessary. This is the immediate solution. The second, but more midterm solution is to realize that there are changes in national consciousness. Younger Zimbabweans don't read as much. They don't intellectualize the struggle as much. They are more materialistic. Is to realize that reality and be able to put out ways and means in which a much more reflective civic education process takes place, especially around rights, and basic rights for that matter. Even before we start talking about freedom of expression, we also talk about rights to water, rights to health. And this can be demonstrably done even for the opposition because they are in charge of local government, or at least as nominally in charge of local government. And they can set examples there about how a local government can actually ensure water comes in, ensure health, public health is looked after, and ensure where they own schools, they are fair with the teachers and are fair about school fees, and they're not just looking to privatize education. So this is the midterm sort of solution where you lead by being pragmatic and by example. The third and long-term solution is if you have either one of the two, if you have a combination of the two that I've mentioned, then you have to reform and reunite a broader opposition political movement and political party movement, but with a different praxis altogether, where you deal with issues based on values and principles and not populism and opportunism. And a good example of this, as a parting shot, is the recovery of the Brazilian party, Labour-backed party that is led currently by President Lula. They lost an election. They recovered. And it is a good example of what can happen. You can recover, but you must recover based on historical, democratic, progressive, and social democratic values.
Thank you so much, Comrade Takura, for taking time to engage on this very important topic. We have met a lot of colleagues across the country who insist that we need a new movement, but the how to get there is problematic, and we really appreciate your insights. And there we have it, viewers. If we are going to have a new movement that really serves the people, we have to be revisiting the question of values to say, what does the movement stand for? We can't if movements around persons but around ideas should have a sound ideological grounding, and we should go through a process of consultations, and we should be prepared to go through thorough political education, find each other, reunite the people, the collective of the working people, and launch a struggle that pushes the agenda of the common person on the streets. There you have it, viewers. Until next time, this is the True Patriot podcast.
Kuchema